Hi everyone, it's Justine, and I'm really excited to show you a super fun technique using some Distress Oxide inks, masking, and embossing all in one. So this is a nice technique-packed video. I'm using the Heartstrings die as well as the Cuddles and Hug stamp from Concord and Ninth. I used this heart die last week in a video, and I had said that I was going to use it again. So I'm grabbing some Inkadinkado masking paper, and I'm going to be die cutting the heart from the center. If you have a full piece of the cardstock, you might want to consider actually not cutting it down because it's really nice to have a nice controlled space when you're distress inking inside. The cool part about this technique is you're not wasting any of the masking paper. You're going to be using the frame around the heart as well as the heart die while you're doing this technique. So I'm going to send this through my machine, and then I'm going to be using both pieces, so don't throw them away. So now that I have my masks ready to go, I grabbed a panel that measures 4 by 5 1/4, as well as this big heart die from the Cuddles and Hug set. It's such a pretty die, and I've seen so many nice cards created with it that I had to grab it. So I'm setting my heart here in the bottom, and it's about halfway up. And I'm putting my card in the top corner of the MISTI for a reason. I'm going to stamp this with Versamark ink, and I'm going to heat emboss it like I would normally do. However, there's a twist in this technique. So now that it's all stamped, and you might want to stamp that more than once if you think you didn't get a nice placement of the ink, I'm going to cover it in some Ranger Superfine embossing powder. With all the small details in the words of this stamp, I definitely want the fine detail embossing powder because if I were to use regular embossing powder, it wouldn't come out as nice. I'm going to tap the back to make sure there's no excess ink, and I'm going to heat emboss this and melt the embossing powder. I'm using the Wagner gun from Hero Arts, and this is definitely the best gun to use for this because your cardstock is eventually going to warp a little bit because you're going to be doing a bunch of heat embossing. And if I were to be using my old tool, I definitely would have had a lot of warpage and it probably wouldn't have worked. Once the heat embossing is finished, you're going to take your mask and you're going to cover the embossed area that you already created. Now this is a little bit tricky if you have bad eyes, so hold it up to the light and you'll get a nice glare in order to stick it down. If it's not perfect, don't worry about it. Now I'm going to keep my stamp actually in the same spot each time, but I'm going to move my cardstock lower each time. Now you want to keep an eye out as to how much lower you're going down, so use the grid on the side of your MISTI. So for example, this one here, I went an 1.25 inches down. So at the top of my MISTI, you can see it's 8.5 inches. So I went down to the 7.25 mark. And then I inked it up with Versamark ink again, and I stamped it onto my cardstock. You want to make sure you're using a firm hand when you're pressing because you want to make sure it gets in the indents of the masking paper. I'm going to be using a magnet here to hold it in place. And as you can see, I'm using quite a firm hand, especially on the area where the mask is because I need it to mask perfectly. Once that's finished, you're going to repeat the steps each time. So I'm going to cover this with embossing powder and heat emboss it, move it down 1.25 inches, and then go ahead and repeat each step. So once I'm finished, I started at 8.5 inches at the top, went to 7.25, then I went to 6 inches and I stamped it again, and then I'm going to go down to 4.75 inches. So again, I'm just going 1.25 inches down from the top of my MISTI down to the bottom, and that's why I love that grid so much, because there's no thinking involved when I'm moving my cardstock and I'm masking. Again, you might have a little bit of issues seeing the embossing powder, and just tilt it up to the light, it'll create a nice shine and you'll be fine. And I love how the MISTI as well, I can go off of the grid and it won't warp my paper at all or bend it. So I'm adding my final addition of the embossing powder, and I'm going to have a total of 4 colors. There was a tiny bit at the top that was still left over, so I actually decided to move my cardstock down and do that final little bit, even though probably nobody would have noticed if I didn't bother. As you can see with my mask, I just had a tiny little piece. Now comes the fun part. Grab the frame of your heart and line it up to where your embossed hearts are. Now, if you are not a beginner, or if you're a beginner stamper or you're not very advanced, or your eyes are terrible like mine, you might not want to do the embossing inside the heart. You might want to just use the heart as a mask and try this technique without the embossing. Then you don't have to worry about lining it up perfectly, you don't have to worry about seeing the embossing powder or anything like that. but I wanted to challenge myself here, and so I created it over top of the embossing. Now the masking paper will not stick well to the embossing powder, so you have to hold down the masking paper as well as the paper with your hands and make sure it doesn't move. Alright, let's get inky. So you're going to go ahead and do regular distressing with the Wilted Violet. As I said, you really got to keep your hand on it because it will move, so try to stick as much part of it onto your craft mat as possible and hold the cardstock. So I'm going through with the whole color, and then I'm going to move it upwards each time, and I'm going to actually blend the inks together. So I'm not worrying about masking off the purple heart. Don't mind my head getting in the way there. And I'm going to grab my worn lipstick and go ahead and blend in there as well. And I'm going to blend into the purple. It's not a lot, but just a little. And I really like how you can create a sort of fun rainbow effect and create this sort of gradient pattern of the hearts going up. I'm going to continue on and on up until the very top with the Spice Marmalade and the Fossilized Amber. It really is a super fun technique. And as I said, you could do this just using the hearts instead of the embossing and save your eyes the trouble. I kind of realized I should have mentioned this at the beginning of the video, but I figure usually people watch the video and then go ahead and make things instead of watching a video tutorial with me and creating right away. So I hope everyone gets that before they get started. And then lastly, I'm going in with the Fossilized Amber. I didn't find a massive color difference between the two, but I still like the way that it turned out, so I wanted to go ahead and just add a little bit more orange to make it a bit darker. At the top, I'm just going to continue and add a tiny little purple piece, so as if the pattern were to start all over again. So this is such a fun and loving background. I love the way that it turned out, and then I simply wanted to embellish by adding a couple of die cuts. So I didn't bother filming the die cuts just to save you a little bit of time while you're watching, but I used this Hugs die from Concord and 9th. It's so cool, and I cut it out in white, and then I cut out its coordinating piece in black so that I could create a nice frame. The card I made last week used the same one, but with the Hello die. I also cut out a small heart using a die, I believe it was from Simon Says Stamp, and I just needed a small heart to add the rest of the sentiment onto the card. So I stamped a sentiment that went with the hugs, and I stamped and kisses with VersaFine black ONYX ink into the center and added that as an embellishment onto my card. Now once I had everything glued together, I glued it with some Tombow Mono liquid adhesive. I just simply added it onto a card base and I was all finished. I hope you enjoyed this fun tutorial and technique using the Distress Oxide, and don't forget, you don't have to do the embossing in between, but I think it looks really fun. So don't worry about perfection, give it a try, give it some practice. I realize I had dirty fingers, and I hope that you enjoyed this tutorial. Thank you so much for watching. I'll have another video for you in just a couple of days, and I'll look forward to seeing you then. Bye! As always, all the supplies used are listed below in the video description as well as on my blog. You can access my blog over on the left, subscribe on the right by clicking on my face, or check out 2 more videos that I think you'll enjoy. Thank you so much for watching!